Hi there, welcome to part 4 of the exchange rates and balance of payments narrated PowerPoints, and what we're going to look at today is two core concepts that you'll need to understand whenever dealing with the exchange rates or balance of payments, and those two things are, one is known as the Marshall-Lerner condition, and the second is the J-curve effect. So far in parts 1, 2 and 3 of the narrated PowerPoints, we've looked at exchange rates and what affects exchange rates. Now what we're going to do is start to look at how exchange rates might affect the balance of payments. And obviously the balance of payments is something we'll look at in a little bit more detail in the next couple of narrated PowerPoints, but fundamentally it's a record of all the international trade between different countries and your own economy. Okay, so that's what we're going to be looking at now. The booklet page numbers are a little bit awry given what the numbers are on the PowerPoints, but this we're starting from the page which is the heading is the impact of exchange rate changes on the balance of payments. Okay, so in this instance, the first thing we're going to look at is the impact of a depreciation in the exchange rate. So essentially the pound becoming weaker against other currencies. And in that sense, remember we looked at Spiced and Whippy and that's something that you can use to help understand what the impact is. But in this instance, we're going to look specifically at the impact of depreciation. And effectively, if we depreciate the value of our currency, that's going to affect both imports and exports because it's going to change the relative price of each of those. And we'll see in a moment that the impact obviously then has an impact on the balance of payments. Now, one of the things that the government can choose to do, and certain governments have done so, and certain economies have done so, is to depreciate the value of the currency in order to try to stimulate some sort of international trade, and we'll look at how that might work in a moment. So first and foremost, if we've got a change, if we've got an impact, then the impact of a depreciation in the value of the currency, essentially that's going to make imports more expensive, and on that basis import volumes will fall, assuming of course that the price elasticity of demand is sufficiently high that it's actually going to make a difference. So if the price changes, or the price falls, generally speaking, we're going to get more demand. If the price falls, we're going to get higher demand. Okay, so in this instance, then imports would, if the government decides to depreciate a currency, is going to mean that imports are more expensive. So import volumes would fall, and on the basis of that, that would clearly be a good thing for trade balance, for the balance of payments. The other thing you need to bear in mind is that it will also have an effect on exports, because exports would essentially become more attractive as the value of our currency has fallen. That essentially means that although the price of exports hasn't changed, we haven't changed our prices as such, the foreign currency value has changed, has actually become more valuable, and as a result of that, export volumes will rise because, again, in relative terms, the price of exports will become cheaper. Okay. So that's the fundamental principle, and obviously the balance of payments is really the difference between imports and exports. So if we can get more exports and less imports, that's going to mean that we're going to have a better position as far as the balance of payments is concerned. Okay. Now, on the basis of that, there is, as I mentioned, two theories that you need to understand and will be able to need to apply. And what we'll be doing in the rest of this narrated PowerPoint is looking at the two different conditions, and then also looking at a typical essay plan for a 25-mark question on how depreciation might affect the balance of payments and performance of an economy. So the first things first, then we need to look at this first theory, which is the Marshall-Lerner condition. And sort of about a quarter of the way down the page in your booklet, it actually gives a fairly concise definition of what the Marshall-Lerner condition is. Okay, and effectively, what the Marshall-Lerner condition says is that if we have a depreciation in the value of the exchange rate, okay, we have a depreciation in the value of our currency, that will actually lead to an improvement in the current account, the difference between imports and exports, so long as the combined price elasticities of both exports and imports are greater than 1. So clearly, if the price changes, then demand hopefully is also going to change as a result of that, but that will depend on the price elasticity for both imports and exports. So if we assume that it is greater than 1, then in the longer term, a depreciation will actually lead to an improvement in the current account. Okay, so that's the first one, the Marshall-Lerner condition. Okay. We're going to look at the short run and the long run in a little bit more detail in a minute, and that will help you to understand hopefully the difference between the two. But the other thing that we also need to consider is something known as the J-curve effect. Now, again, if we look slightly further down on the page headed "The Impact of Exchange Rate Changes on the Balance of Payments," you'll see a nice simple chart which actually demonstrates the next thing we're going to look at, which is the J-curve effect. Now, this is specifically relevant to depreciation of a currency. Okay, in essence, what it's saying is that in the short run, with depreciation, if we depreciate our currency, that's probably going to lead to a deterioration in the current account position in the first instance before things start to improve. And if you think about it, it sort of links back to one of the evaluative points we talked about before, are based on time lags. Okay, so if we take a look at the diagram where we've got trade surplus, trade deficit, we've got a currency appreciation happening here. If you just follow my cursor, so trade surplus, trade deficit, we actually start the currency depreciation at this point, and in the first instance, that clearly is going to cause the deficit to increase in the initial period after depreciation, because obviously the value of our currency has fallen, but certain contracts, etc., won't be able to change. Maybe businesses won't necessarily be able to change their own sort of behavior in the short term. So in the first instance, a depreciation in the value of the currency is likely to cause a further trade deficit. However, over time, there will be a net improvement. Okay, now effectively what that's saying is that as time goes by, that depreciation will actually start to demonstrate an improvement for the same reasons that we talked about as far as the Marshall-Lerner condition was concerned. If we've got a combined price elasticity for exports and imports that's greater than 1, then an exchange rate depreciation will actually improve the balance of payments. Okay, and obviously in that situation, that then means that it's a potential policy tool that a government could use to try to address issues around the balance of payments. Okay, so you'll see that we've posed some questions. Class discussion. That's a slightly tricky one in the position that we find ourselves at the moment. But what I would like you to do is just think about in the short run, what sort of effect would the short run PED for imports and exports being inelastic, and why would that happen in the short run? And then in the longer run, why do you think that long run PED for imports and exports would be more elastic? So obviously you can go away and do a little bit of internet research and take a look in your booklet. There is actually on the flip side of the page we just talked about a little bit more detail on the J-curve effect and also on the Marshall-Lerner condition. So take a look at those notes, highlight them as you see fit. And then obviously we can come back and discuss both the short run and the long run issues once you've had a go at completing that yourself. So I'll give you a few minutes to do that, and then we'll carry on and take a look at the difference between the short run and the long run as far as the J-curve and the Marshall-Lerner condition are concerned. Okay, so over to you to do a little bit of work yourself. Okay, so let's take a look at the short run then. In the first instance, the short run for PED for imports and exports is likely to be inelastic. Reasons for that? Well, effectively, in the first instance, import values are likely to rise, export values are likely to fall, and therefore there is going to be a deterioration in the current account in the first instance, because the depreciation, the difference in value, is actually going to hurt essentially the value of exports and also increase the value of imports in the short term. That, as we'll see, in the long run, that does change somewhat. But let's have a look and see the reasons for that. Okay. So in the longer run, where we're starting to get a more elastic position, as far as PED is concerned for both imports and exports, we're going to find that export volumes will rise, import volumes might fall, and as a result of that, there will be an improvement in the current account position. The current account, remember, being the difference between imports and exports. Okay, so again, take a look at the info that's provided with in your booklet on the following page to the one we've just discussed, because that will also help you to understand that in a bit more detail. And there is lots written about and lots of examples that you can go and take a look at, maybe on Econs Plus Dial or even Tutor to You, which will just go into the Marshall-Lerner condition and the J-curve effect in a little bit more detail. But these are two things that you should be thinking about quoting whenever you see anything to do with depreciation in a currency or appreciation in a currency. The fact is that those things may have an effect, positive or negative, on imports or exports, depending on which you're actually choosing to do. But there is this time lag. But in the grand scheme of things, the J-curve effect applies, where the short term depreciation will lead to deterioration in the current account position, and then it will start to improve. And as you can see from the chart, the reason it's called a J-curve is you can see it is essentially the shape of a J, as you can see as if you trace the graph, the shape of the graph there. Okay, so those are two key things that you need to bear in mind, two key models that you will need to be able to quote and certainly demonstrate it with a diagram or two, and also explaining the reasons why the Marshall-Lerner condition might be at play. As I mentioned again, you can see on the next page in your booklet, there's a diagram which you can actually add some details to based on the PowerPoint that we've just gone through, and also on the previous slide, previous page in your booklet, and that hopefully will help you to understand the two core concepts here, both Marshall-Lerner condition and the J-curve effect. Okay, so what I'd like you to think about now, obviously we spent quite a bit of time looking at exchange rates and how they can affect the value of different things, and then we've talked more specifically now about how it can affect the balance of payments. What I'd like you to consider now is there's an extended essay plan, which obviously is headed up essay plan, and the essay plan is based on the question: to what extent might a depreciation in the value of the country's currency improve its economic performance? And that's a 25-mark question. Okay. Now you'll see that over 2 pages there is quite a detailed essay plan for you to work through and go through step by step. Okay. Now what I would suggest you do is spend a little bit of time looking at that. Obviously there's a whole range. It's almost like a It's not quite a fill in the gaps job, but it does sort of demonstrate the process that we think you should be considering for any 25 mark question, really, in terms of how you might go about it. But this one is more specifically looking at this issue of depreciation. Again, looking at that question, we need to look at the command words in the question. To what extent might depreciation in the value of a country's currency improve its economic performance? So first and foremost, if it's a to what extent question, we've clearly got to present a number of different options. We've clearly got to consider why and what depreciation in the value of a country's currency might be, and maybe produce some sort of definition as to what that is and why a government or a country might choose to do that, and then how it could potentially improve its economic performance. So it's quite a general question. 25 mark question is general. I do tend to be a fairly general question. But what we suggest you do is go through the process of, number one, defining the term depreciation. Number two, look at explaining, as it said here, the different ways in which economic performance might be assessed. Now, clearly, in this instance, you could use different ways in which the country's economy and its performance is measured. So we can use the whole icebergs principle, remember some of the macroeconomic objectives that the government is trying to achieve. And then, so we've defined our terminology in terms of our depreciation of the exchange rate and some of the things that can, well, if we define it in the first instance, what is it? What is the depreciation of the exchange rate? Then look at ways in which we might decide to try to assess how our economic performance is and how we might be able to improve it. And then we look more specifically at explaining the effect on prices and the demand for exports and imports that a depreciation in the value of our currency might have. Okay. Then we're suggesting that you actually include something and explain the Marshall-Lerner condition and how that has an effect on these things, and also introduce some knowledge to demonstrate this principle of the J-curve effect. So obviously explaining what the Marshall-Lerner condition is, and also then using the J-curve effect. So if ever there's a question on depreciation, very important that you consider those two things. Okay. Clearly, it gives you a chance to look at short run and long run, and whenever we're talking about trying to put a decent evaluative conclusion together, whenever we've got a question of this nature, the fact that you can say, this is how we feel this might affect things in the short term, however, in the long term, this actually could be blah, 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 etc., etc. Okay, so again, giving some idea of how you might be able to go about that. Okay, no harm in actually including the J-curve diagram in a question of this nature either. Okay, and also think about using in conjunction with the J-curve effect. How is that going to how is the principle of a change in the value of imports and exports going to affect aggregate demand? Clearly, if we believe that exports will improve, exports and net trade, essentially the difference between imports and exports and imports. Obviously, if that changes, that's going to have an effect on aggregate demand, and that could then have an impact on the economic performance of a country. Okay. Now, bearing in mind that so that's the starting point, if you like. But then, what we've got to think about when we're talking about a 25 marker, it's very much a case of looking at how is this policy potentially going to affect things like other macroeconomic objectives, for instance, inflation, growth, and unemployment. So if we have a change in aggregate demand caused by this policy, how is that change in demand going to affect other major macroeconomic objectives like inflation, like economic growth, and unemployment? So considering those would clearly be a very good way to go. Could also think about how this might affect short-run aggregate supply, and think about how a rise in import prices would affect businesses. Okay, so if import prices go up and you're dependent on imports for offering your goods and services to the market, then clearly that is going to cause an increase in your cost, and that obviously is going to then affect supply. Okay. So what we've tried to do is sort of demonstrate step by step how you might complete an essay of this type, but clearly what we would want to do is also come up with a nice, strong, evaluative conclusion. Now, we've talked about this principle of DIPS, so depends on impact of measures, tests also external factors, short-term, long-term, and also a solution to the question. So trying to use this type of language where you're trying to say this could happen, but it could depend on this, and the impact of this could then, as a result, do this, etc., etc. But again, we've tried to give some examples of the typical way in which you might use sort of concluding arguments. So looking at how far the currency is going to fall and for how long, that clearly is going to have an impact, maybe a longer term impact over on this particular issue. Okay, if we're talking about the level of demand from export markets, etc., if we're talking about how that might affect things, obviously, if we're going to change the price of or the value of our currency, that's only going to benefit us if there isn't a massive recession in some of our export markets, for instance. So thinking about the other things that might be at play. So this policy might seem a good idea. However, on a world stage or in a macroeconomic context, an international context, that may not necessarily have the effect that we would desire. Okay. So again, a couple of other things that you can consider in your conclusion: the effect on growth and employment will be dependent on the gradient of the aggregate supply curve, and then we've talked about that in a little bit more detail. Okay. Also, the effect on growth and employment is going to depend on how much the AD curve shifts and how much the AS curve shifts. So understanding the principle of that and whether there's any spare capacity in the economy is clearly going to have a fairly major impact, and that gives you an idea of how you could go about answering this essay. What I'd like you to do on the basis of us going through this process is to spend a bit of time considering it, filling in the blanks if you like, doing a little bit of research, creating the ideal essay plan for this particular question, and test yourself. Have a go at completing it in time conditions. Okay, so first and foremost, a little bit of a summary, then highlight your command words in the question. Clearly in this instance, we got to what extent we clearly need to be giving a balanced argument. Okay, we've definitely got to talk about depreciation in the value of a country's currency, okay, and how that might take place. And also in this case, what if it does take place, is it likely to improve economic performance? Okay, so there's three elements to it really. We've got to be able to give a balanced argument. We've got to be able to understand and demonstrate depreciation of a currency, maybe include some models, like in this instance, Lerner Condition and J curve effect, and also then consider ways in which a country might choose to measure its economic performance and to see how that might affect, in this instance, the response to your essay. Okay, remember for a 25 marker, it's always split in this way at A level. 25 mark question, you've got 16 marks for knowledge, application and analysis, and you've got 9 marks for evaluation. And remember, based on the 25 mark questions that you've received back recently from me, that there are levels involved in those for both the KAA knowledge, application analysis, and also for evaluation. Certainly in this instance, look at making 3 points and evaluate each point. Definitely use any examples that you've got to hand or that you can research to support your arguments. So you might make a statement about something, but then if you can, use an example which is actually helping to illustrate the point that you've made, but also supporting that. you should definitely be looking at a conclusion, an evaluative conclusion, which is demonstrating your understanding not just of this particular issue, but also in a global context, how that might actually then affect other parts of the way the economy or the world economy is working, how that might affect your answer in some shape or form. Definitely write a plan, guys. I know I keep banging on about it. It's a very important principle. If you write your plan and stick to it, it gives you some sort of guide, some sort of clarity in terms of your thought process, and you can deal with each point as they come up. Okay, and it helps in terms of the flow and the nature of the way in which you can then write your essay. If you know where you're going, it makes such a big difference. Okay. And as I mentioned, once you've gone through that process, and we've given you some fairly clear guidance, and I think if you use that as some sort of template for any 25-mark question, you're not going to go too far wrong. In this instance, obviously, we've changed the content to suit, in this case, our question on depreciation in the country's currency. But you could just as easily apply this same principle or these same principles to any other 25-mark question. Okay, so a little bit of work for you to do. The guidance within your booklet should help you, but also the more that you practice this process, the more that you actually attempt to write your essay, the better you're going to get at it. So thanks for listening. Obviously, any questions, please respond via Google Classroom or via email. And I'll speak to you shortly on the next part 5, which will be where we start to look in a little bit more detail at the way in which the balance of payments is structured.